This is Dr. Michael Bogart with the UnDiscovered Bible Project. We're here in Israel to explore Bible mysteries, to uncover some things that many people either don't know much about or have wondered about as they read their Bibles. And also we're here to show people who don't know much about the Bible at all some of the great treasures hidden in this ancient book, treasured by Jews and Christians alike. So if you're ready, let's take you on our undiscovered Bible quest. If you've done much reading in the Bible, you will know that it makes a big deal about sin, the transgression of God's nature and God's ways. It also speaks at length of how sin can be dealt with in people's lives. In the Old Testament, shared by Jews and Christians, it prescribed a sacrificial system for ancient Israel to cover transgressions of the covenant delivered through Moses. The New Testament heralds a new covenant in which sin can be atoned for through the death and resurrection of Jesus. So, the Bible says a lot about the forgiveness of sins, big and small. But as someone who's been in ministry many years, I have met people, as maybe you have, who believe that their sins and failures are just too big for God to forgive. To people who have made a series of destructive choices in life, as well as to many others, all of that Bible talk about atonement sounds pretty theoretical. But is there anything concrete that demonstrates God's real forgiveness for those who seek it? Well, in our video tour of Israel, the UnDiscovered Bible team saw abundant evidence of God's forgiveness, literally scattered all over the ground at a place called Shiloh. According to Joshua 18:1, from the time of Joshua through the era of the judges, Shiloh, or Shiloh, was the site of Israel's national worship. Using the Bible's own internal dating system, which is based on the marker given in 1 Kings 6:1, Shiloh served as Israel's worship center for the centuries roughly between 1300 and 1000 BC. During this time in their history, the people of Israel were settled in tribal units from Lebanon in the north to the Negev desert in the far south. Also included in Israel's tribal territories were large chunks of land within the modern countries of Jordan and Syria. Now, a glance at the tribal map of ancient Israel shows that Shiloh was in an ideal central location where the tribes could gather for worship and sacred assemblies. However, the book of Judges records that even though Israel solemnly vowed to keep their covenant with God at Mount Sinai, and again, as they prepared to enter and settle the land of promise in the book of Deuteronomy, they struggled to remain faithful to that vow. Now, before we beat up on these people, let's be real. The ancient Israelites were no different than people today. Solemn vows made at one time of life are very easy to break later when the going gets rough. So as the years passed and the generations came and went, Israel faltered on their promises. For example, at least 2 rival centers featuring idol worship were established during the era of the Judges. One at Dan in the north, that's in Judges 18, and another at Shechem in the south near Shiloh, that's in Judges 8. The worship site at Shechem, called Baal Berith, is especially significant because it was located at the site where God met with Abraham centuries before, and it's only about 10 miles north of Shiloh. That's 16 kilometers. And I think it's really sad that at the place where God made a covenant with Abraham, his descendants built a center for worship that greatly dishonored him. But even though some Israelites were unfair, year by year, many of them continued to assemble for worship at Shiloh. So let me give some quick background on Israel's system of worship. Remember that the people of Israel were descended from the sons of Jacob, Abraham's grandson. These sons of Jacob were the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. And one of these tribes was Levi, or Levi. You may remember that this tribe was set apart for religious service. In essence, they were the clergy of Israel. When Israel came out of Egyptian slavery and eventually settled the land that God promised them, all of the tribes received portions of land except the Levites. Instead, the Levites were settled among all the other tribes to teach the Torah and supervise religious life. They also served at the Tabernacle and later at the permanent temple to oversee worship. Now, a central feature of worship was a system of animal sacrifices that atoned for sin. These sacrifices were made by priests called Kohanim, who were Levite descendants of Moses' brother Aaron. The tabernacle was the central feature of Israelite worship from their wanderings in the wilderness until Solomon constructed the permanent temple in Jerusalem around 960 BC. Exodus 26 records that during Israel's 40 years in the wilderness, Moses ordered the construction of a movable structure that could be transported from place to place fairly easily. The tabernacle structure was constructed of wood, fabric, and animal skins. It was furnished with several key pieces of furniture. First was the Ark of the Covenant. It was a box made from acacia wood and overlaid with beaten gold. Its dimensions were about 2.5 cubits long by 1.5 cubits high and wide. That's 4 feet by 2.5 feet, or 1.25 meters by 3/4 meter for those with a metric system. In the Ark of the Covenant, there were 3 items: the tablets of the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna, and Aaron's staff of authority. Next, there was the 7-branched golden candlestick called the menorah, an altar for burning incense, and a table for displaying 12 loaves of bread, reminding Israel of how God had sustained the 12 tribes in the wilderness. Outside were a massive basin of water and a bronze altar for burning sacrifices. At the tabernacle and later at the temple, the focus was worship of God through offerings and sacrifices. So, let's say that you had broken one of the laws of Torah and needed to make sacrifice to atone for your sin. You would bring to the temple the appropriate animal for sacrifice. You would appear before one of the Levites on duty who would examine your sacrifice to make sure it was not defective. Then he would call for one of the priests, a Kohen. The priest would place your hands on the animal's head to transfer your sin. Then the animal would be quickly and humanely slaughtered. Its blood would be sprinkled on the huge altar in the temple courtyard, and its meat butchered. After making the sacrifice, the Levites would keep a portion of the animal's meat, and the rest would be given back to the worshiper for a celebratory meal. Offerings could also be made from your crop of grain as a thanksgiving for the blessings of life. So for around 3 centuries, the tribes of Israel gathered to worship God and make atonement for sin through sacrifice at the tabernacle in Shiloh. As I mentioned, the worshipers would eat a meal celebrating the atonement of their transgressions before returning home. But it seems that there was an added feature of the worship at Shiloh that underscored for them the reality that their sins were actually forgiven. After making sacrifice at the tabernacle, the celebratory meal would be eaten on the hillside surrounding the area. Picture hundreds of families at certain times of the year eating in this natural amphitheater surrounding Shiloh. So after eating their meal, they did something very symbolic. They broke the pots, bowls, and other utensils used in the meal, and they left the shattered pieces on the ground. I think this was a sign that atonement had been made and that relationship with God was restored, and they could re-enter full life with the people of Israel. The countless pieces of broken pottery still scattered on the surface of the ground to this day on the hillsides around Shiloh bear testimony to this truth. So after the sacrificial meal was consumed by the family of the person making the sacrifice, it was required in the law that those pots be smashed to signify that the transgression was ended and paid for. And just a few minutes ago, our team found some of the hundreds of thousands of examples of broken pottery on these hills surrounding Shiloh. So here's a piece of a pot that was perhaps broken during this celebration of sacrifice. Here's the handle from a pot. And isn't it great to know that God actually forgives and forgets? It's done with. You don't have to carry the guilt throughout the rest of your life. Of course, Christianity teaches that Jesus is the sacrifice for sins. He's the final sacrifice. He's the one who covers all of sin. You're done. You don't have to go back. There's no guilt. Romans says that there's now no more condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So the New Testament agrees with the principle of complete forgiveness and atonement in the Old Testament. And all of this was centered here for about 350 years until Solomon moved the tabernacle to Jerusalem. We'll see that in a later segment. So what does this mean, especially for Christian believers today who still bear feelings of guilt over past deeds? Well, I think it should vividly underscore that Jesus' death on the cross washed those transgressions away completely. No more guilt, no more shame, freedom to live in newness of life. So Israel assembled at Shiloh for the required annual festivals and to make sacrifices and offerings as needed. According to the ancient Jewish writings known as the Talmud, Shiloh was the focus of Israel's national life and worship for 369 years. After the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel 4, the importance of Shiloh began to decline. And according to 1 Samuel 4, 1 through 11 and Psalm 78, 56 through 61, Shiloh was burned by the Philistines and abandoned by Israel as their central place of worship. The city of Jerusalem eventually took Shiloh's place as the center of Israel's worship, and the tabernacle was replaced by a permanent temple during the reign of King Solomon. Well, now let's move on to our study assignment. Start by reading the following Bible portions related to the central importance of Shiloh in Israel's early history. Read Joshua 18, 1 through 10, and Joshua 21, 1 through 3.
The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The country was brought under their control, but there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not yet received their inheritance. So Joshua said to the Israelites, "How long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you? Appoint 3 men from each tribe. I will send them out to make a survey of the land and to write a description of it, according to the inheritance of each. The Levites, however, do not get a portion among you, because the priestly service of the Lord is their inheritance." So the men left and went through the land. They wrote its description on a scroll, town by town, in 7 parts, and returned to Joshua in the camp at Shiloh. Joshua then cast lots for them in Shiloh, in the presence of the Lord, and there he distributed the land to the Israelites according to their tribal divisions. Now the family heads of the Levites approached Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the other tribal families of Israel at Shiloh in Canaan, and said to them, "The Lord commanded through Moses that you give us towns to live in, with pasture lands for our livestock." So as the Lord had commanded, the Israelites gave the Levites towns and pasture lands out of their own inheritance.
Shiloh was an important location in Israel's early history for a number of reasons besides the worship of God at the tabernacle. For example, Joshua divided the land of promise among the tribes of Israel there, giving each tribe territory that would fit its size and needs. According to 1 Samuel 1, 1 through 20, Hannah prayed for a son at Shiloh. Her son Samuel became a key figure in Israel's national life during those very critical times. He was the last of the judges, the first of the national prophets, and the maker of Israel's first kings. 1 Samuel 4:1 says, "Samuel's word came to all Israel." He was as important to Israel in his day as Moses was in his day. But then on a sadder note, Eli's sons, who served as priests at the tabernacle at Shiloh, corrupted Israel's worship and dishonored God. That's in 1 Samuel 2, 12 through 17.
Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." If the person said to him, "Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt.
So what was going on there? Remember that during a sacrifice, part of the animal was offered as a burnt offering on the altar to the Lord. Another part of the sacrifice was given to the Levites and priests as their portion, as their pay, so to speak. The rest was given back to the worshipers so that they could eat a meal celebrating that their sin was dealt with. Eli's sons were demanding more than their allotted share. In other words, they were involved in extortion by taking part of the worshippers' share of the meat. And to top it off, they wanted to roast the meat that they took, which was a problem because the law of Moses forbade the eating of blood. So when this passage talks about the people boiling their share of the meat, they were doing as the law commanded. What Eli's sons were doing was demanding meat so that they could roast it and eat it with the blood still inside. That completely disregarded God's law. So what Eli's sons were doing was an open affront to God. Here are some questions for further discussion. From the huge volume of broken pottery that visitors can still find scattered around the hillsides at Shiloh, it seems clear that after worship, the Israelites broke the pottery used in their sacrificial meals. The breaking of the pottery used in these meals almost certainly symbolized the breaking of sin, guilt, and shame in their lives. Now notice that in 1 Samuel 1, Hannah only felt free to petition the Lord after her meal was finished.
Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly, and she made a vow, saying, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him."
How do you think the Israelite worshipers felt after breaking their pottery at Shiloh? The sacrifices offered at Shiloh in the tabernacle were based on the covenant that God made with Israel through Moses. The New Testament speaks at length of the sacrifice Jesus made on the cross as ushering in a new covenant of grace. How does Hebrews 10, 1 through 14 compare the two covenants? Romans 8:1 says, "Therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because through Christ, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. Yet some Christians are still plagued by a sense of guilt." What are some of the causes of feelings of guilt and shame in believers? Well, not everyone can travel to Shiloh and pick up pieces of pottery like the UnDiscovered Bible team did. If the shattering of pottery at Shiloh was a graphic sign to Israelite worshipers that their sins were covered, what tangible signs can Christians use today to realize the truth that their sins are washed away forever? Most everyone today would agree that worship can happen in any place, in a building, at home, maybe some beautiful natural location, or maybe even in a garbage dump if you have to. The attitude is what matters. But buildings can enhance worship. So what are the pros and cons of having a gathering place for people to use as a focal point of worship on a regular basis? Okay, let's take a final moment to review. According to the book of Joshua, Shiloh was the site of Israel's national worship during the era of the Judges. Using the Bible's own internal dating system based on 1 Kings 6:1, we can estimate that Shiloh served as Israel's worship center sometime between 1350 and 1000 BC. During this time, Shiloh played a central role in a number of ways. Then, beginning just before the time of David, the importance of Shiloh as the focus of Israel's worship began to decline until it was replaced by a permanent temple in Jerusalem. So what have we learned? First, we saw that the central feature at Shiloh was the tabernacle, which was a movable structure that was transported during Israel's sojourn in the wilderness. The tabernacle was constructed of various elements, wood, fabric, and animal skins. It was furnished with the Ark of the Covenant, the 7-branched menorah candlestick, and several other items of sacred furniture. We also learned that Israel's worship was overseen by the tribe of Levi, with the animal sacrifices made by priests or the Kohanim, who were descendants of Moses' brother Aaron. Then we saw from the huge volume of broken pottery still scattered around the hillsides that the Israelites broke the pottery used in their sacrificial meals to symbolize the breaking of sin, guilt, and shame. What a clear and hopeful picture of God's forgiveness that is. In the next episode, we'll be taking a look at the temple in Jerusalem, the place where Israel worshipped after the Philistines destroyed the tabernacle at Shiloh. We'll pinpoint what we believe is the true location of Israel's ancient, magnificent sanctuary, first built by King Solomon, and then another temple was built and added onto by Herod much later. We will also consider whether there could be another temple built on the same site in the future as some Jews hope to do. See you then. This is Dr. Michael Bogart for the UnDiscovered Bible.